Hey, welcome to week 4. We're in chapter 19. You might be wondering why we're not doing 17 and 18. We're doing those, but we're going to skip them for now. And we've been talking about the blood and how the cardiovascular system moves blood, and that one part of that is respiratory gases dissolved in the blood. And so I thought we'd go ahead and do respiratory system after immune and lymphatic. The reason we covered immune and lymphatic right after blood and cardiovascular is because those lymphatic vessels run right along with the blood vessels. And so trying to make this all connect for you easier. And so this is the respiratory system, and when you think about respiration, you probably think about breathing and getting oxygen in and getting CO2 out, and you're right. If only it were that easy, right? Like that's simple. I love the respiratory system. I appreciate breathing. Oxygen is your number one goal. You want oxygen over everything else. So I'm still getting over my cold, by the way, so apologize for the coughing. So we're going to start in the respiratory system with looking at an overview. And so this is how we're going to bring oxygen into our body, but not only do we have to get it into the internal structures of our body, but diffuse it into our blood. And then, of course, the blood takes that oxygen to the cells of our systematic circuit and drops it off to pick up the carbon dioxide, put it back into the lungs, and then move it through the tubes to the outside of the body. So we'll go into detail more of that here. It's a bunch of passages, and they have to be moist because you need moisture for diffusion to occur. And part of the respiratory system does filter and warm this air that's coming in. As a wannabe runner in the winter months, you're definitely wanting to breathe in through the nose. There's more structures in the nasal passages to warm the air and filter it. So I'm constantly thinking in through the nose, out through the mouth. This is how we speak and make vocal sounds. The respiratory system helps with sense of smell unless you have a cold, and it even helps regulate the pH of the body. So a little homeostasis there. So what is respiration? It's this exchange of gas between the atmosphere and the body cells. And we have to do this, we have to give oxygen to the cells for them to do cellular respiration, where they take oxygen and glucose and break that glucose down into ATP so that the cell can do work. So we're going to divide this up into some types of respiration. We have external respiration. This is just breathing, getting air from the outside of the body to the internal structures of the lung, which, by the way, isn't exactly in the body yet because it hasn't passed through a membrane. But so they call that external respiration. And we might use the word ventilation or breathing, inhalation, and exhalation. Internal respiration is when that gas goes into the blood and out to the cells. And then cell respiration, what I mentioned, is that oxygen goes into the cell to produce ATP for cellular work. So what are the organs you need to focus on? Well, there's the upper respiratory tract and the lower. And so upper, we'll look at nose and the nasal cavities, sinuses, the pharynx and the larynx. And then your lower respiratory tract is trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs. And so here are pictures of those things. So we'll look at sinuses and the nares, or the nostrils, the oral cavity, larynx, larynx, that's your voice box, trachea, your windpipe, and those things. So nose, external nares is the science word for nostrils, and this is where air can enter and leave into the nasal cavity, and it does have some hairs to help filter. It's this hollow space, right? And your right and left nose is divided by the nasal septum. So if you put your finger to the middle of your nose, you're touching your nasal septum. And then you have these conchae. And these are bones that are inside the cavity that increase the surface area inside and help warm the air coming in. The upper portion has olfactory receptors, so that's olfactory is smell. And then there's a bunch of mucous membrane. And so this is pseudostratified ciliated epithelial. And you'll have goblet cells that produce mucus, cilia that sweep mucus towards the pharynx where it's swallowed. And then these pathogens or anything that's trapped will be digested. And this keeps you from, is supposed to keep you from having an infection. I mentioned that it warms the air, it moistens it, and it filters it as it comes in. And these nasal conchae line the nasal cavity and, again, increase the surface area. And so here you can see the nasal conchae, and there is a superior, middle, and inferior conchae. And again, this is just more ridges for more surface area so that the air coming into the lungs will be moist for diffusion, warm, or at least almost body temperature, and then, of course, filtered so things don't get into the lower respiratory system. And then nostril, the science term was nares. So you're going to see these goblet cells here, and then they're making mucus, and then you have all this epithelial cells with cilia that can help move material. Let me show you this picture at the beginning. Here's those goblet cells here that are making lots of mucus, and then here's the ciliated epithelial cells. All right, so there's a cross section of them, and pretty simple structure there. So we have a few sinuses, and I believe there's 4 paranasal sinuses. So, yep, maxillary, frontal, ethmoid, and sphenoid. Sinuses named after the space within the bone they're found. So remember, sinuses are just holes or spaces. And what they do is reduce the weight of the skull so that your head isn't so heavy. And also, they are what makes your voice sound the way it does. And that's why I sound real nasally right now, because my sinuses are infected. I have sinusitis, infection or allergic reaction. It blocks the sinus drainages and causes pressure and headache. And I love this photo, this x-ray. You can see this sinus is right here, and then here in the x-ray. So maxillary in your maxilla, frontal, ethmoid, and sphenoid. So how does smoking affect your respiratory system? We know that it's not good for it, but why? Because the chemicals in the smoke actually paralyze your cilia, and so you can't cough up any phlegm from your respiratory system and help get rid of it. And so that's why you're going to end up with smoker's cough, because you're just constantly getting mucus clogged up and you're trying to cough it up, but your cilia is no longer functioning. And that can relate to bronchitis. And remember, the suffix itis means inflammation. And so this is inflammation of the bronchial tubes. It says bronchial thickening can result in difficulty with expiration or breathing out. And then your alveolar walls are destroyed. And this can create emphysema. And that leads oftentimes to lung cancer. And 20%, they say, of smokers will have lung cancer. So the pharynx is your throat. Okay, so pharynx is your throat. And there is a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. And they're named after what structures they're located next to. So your throat behind your nose is the nasopharynx, and it's right above that soft palate. Remember, if you want to touch your soft palate, I can't do it with my tongue, but when you touch the roof of your mouth with your tongue, you have hard palate. But if you go back further in the back on the roof of your mouth, you're going to feel that soft palate. And so your nasopharynx is right above that, and behind your mouth is the oropharynx. So oro means mouth, and so this is right below the nasopharynx, and this is where food and air passageway. Nasopharynx, you do not want food going into your nasopharynx or your nasal passages at all. So nasopharynx, air only. Oropharynx, food and air, because you're going to swallow the food into your oropharynx. And then laryngopharynx is right below, right inferior to the oropharynx. And so this is going to lead to either larynx or the esophagus. And so food will also go here as you start to swallow the food. So the larynx is this airway that's enlarged, and this is going to be your voice box. So this is where we find our vocal cords. So next to pharynx, I want you to write throat. Next to larynx is the voice box, and you can remember that because it's la, 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 like singing, larynx. And so this has muscles and cartilage, and we have 3 large single cartilages found here. Your Adam's apple is the thyroid cartilage. It's the largest one, and the thyroid gland covers the lower part of it, so it's named after the thyroid gland, and we'll look at it in just a second. The cricoid is right below the thyroid cartilage, and then your epiglottic is the central part of your epiglottis, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. There are 3 pairs of smaller cartilages. You don't need to know those, but they do help regulate speech and close the larynx during swallowing. So let's look at this. Here's this epiglottic cartilage. Now your epiglottis is behind your tongue. And so if you were to put your finger in your mouth, wash your hands first if you're doing this, but if you were to put your finger in your mouth and you slide your finger back to the very back of your tongue, you're going to feel a little cartilaginous flap, and that's your epiglottis. Here is what it looks like from the posterior. So anterior right here, that's like if your tongue were here, you would be touching your tongue and touch that epiglottis. Here's the thyroid cartilage, that's your Adam's apple. And then right under there, the cricoid cartilage. And then you've got some cartilaginous rings of the trachea. And then looking at it from that posterior side or view is that big epiglottic cartilage, and then the large thyroid cartilage, and then that cricoid cartilage. All those cartilages are to protect those structures. The larynx contains 2 pairs of horizontal vocal cords. So there are false vocal cords and true vocal cords. So your false vocal cords are your upper vestibular folds, and they don't produce any sound, which is why they're calling them false vocal cords, but they help close that airway. The true vocal cords are the lower ones that actually do produce sound by vibration, and the combination of your true vocal cords along with this opening is called the glottis, and so you can see that here. The glottis is the opening, and then you've got your true vocal cords. Here's these false vocal cords. They're just for opening and closing, and then your true vocal cords are in here. Hard to see in this picture, but they vibrate for sound. Your trachea, your windpipe. And so this is running anterior to your epiglottis. Not epiglottis. To your esophagus. So your windpipe is this long tube, and it's got these cartilaginous rings, and they call them C-shape because they're just protecting the front. And this trachea goes down from the esophagus down into the chest, where you eventually splits into the primary, the first branch, the bronchi. It is lined with that ciliated mucous membrane, those pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial we saw with the goblet cells I showed you pictures of. So that's all in this trachea. There's no diffusion happening here. This is strictly for filtering the air, moving phlegm out of the lower respiratory system and moistening the air with the mucus and trapping things, right? There's 20 C-shape of those hyaline cartilage rings, and that helps it stabilize it and keeps it open. The back of it does not have any cartilage, and that's going to be important because when we swallow food, that tube is running right behind the trachea, and you want food to, if you swallow like a large bolus or something, you're going to want that to impede on the windpipe just a little bit, and it wouldn't be able to do that if you had cartilaginous rings on the back side. So a tracheostomy is where they cut an opening in your trachea. You've probably heard of somebody having a trach tube inserted so that they can breathe, and that's usually because some object is lodged. I remember back in the day they would say, like, take a pencil and jam it into somebody's trachea if they're choking. They don't really recommend that anymore. I'm kind of glad. So remember that larynx is this huge structure that includes the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. Your epiglottic cartilage would be up here, and then you've got this trachea and all these cartilaginous rings, and eventually this trach is going to break into these bronchi, primary bronchi, and then secondary and tertiary, and it just keeps branching off and branching off. So this is just this tube for air to go into our chest with. If you look at it, you can see this cartilaginous ring, this hyaline cartilage. See how it's a C shape if you turned your computer sideways? Here is where, if you were to swallow, food could kind of push on this connective tissue in this muscle here. This is the cartoon picture. Here's an actual cross-section of that. Remember, lumen is just space within the trachea. And then here is them showing an incision of the trachea if they were going to do a tracheostomy. So let's go to the bronchial tree. This is these branched airways that lead from the trachea and that are going to go to these air sacs called the alveoli. And so starting with the trachea, it kind of looks like an upside down tree, which is why they call it that. And it has all these branches like a tree does. And so here's what happens. If we go from the trachea, we'll have a right and left primary bronchi. And so each one of those is headed to a lung. And then you have secondary and tertiary bronchi. So it's telling you about where they're entering and how many there are. And then there's bronchioles, intralobular bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles. And then you get to the respiratory bronchioles, and this is the first place that you can actually do some gas exchange, some diffusion. And then from these, the alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and the actual alveoli are the microscopic air sacs. That is where gas exchange happens. And so pretty amazing. All this can do gas exchange right here. And I've read where if you could open up your lungs and lay all your alveoli, undo those little bitty, they're like spongy material. If you laid it all out flat, it would cover, the surface area would cover a tennis court. That's one person. So a lot of surface area for a lot of diffusion of those gases. And so you can see this trachea here with all their cartilaginous rings. Here you have a primary bronchus, the right primary bronchus, and the left primary bronchus. And then you've got your secondary branches, and then tertiary branches off of that. Once you get to a intralobular bronchial, it'll go to a terminal bronchial, and then a respiratory bronchial, and then you have this alveolar duct, this passageway into this huge alveolar sac, which has all these little alveoli. Notice what's surrounding them. This is going to be pulmonary circuit. So this is capillary beds for gas exchange in the pulmonary circuit. And so remember, arteries would bring blood away from the heart here, and then veins would bring that oxygenated blood back from the pulmonary circuit to the left side of the heart. And so here's a cool cast from a bronchial tree. And here's what alveolar look like. So you can see these tiny little sacs, super thin, single layer of cells for quick diffusion there, and then capillaries embedded everywhere to pick up and drop off gases. All right, so from the main bronchi, remember those have branched off of the trachea. We no longer have these cartilaginous rings. So if you see cartilaginous rings, you're in trachea. But these rings change into these plates, and they do completely surround the tube. But as those branching tubes become thinner and thinner, the amount of cartilage is going to decrease. So it totally disappears by the time you're in bronchioles, and that's going to allow changes in the diameter. You'll be able to constrict or dilate the bronchioles, and also do some eventually gas exchange. The smooth muscle becomes more prominent and then diminishes as the bronchioles go to alveolar ducts, where it totally disappears, because at the alveolar ducts we are doing some gas exchange there. Let's see, and then we see some histology changes as these respiratory tubes become thinner. It says pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial is in the larger tubes we've been looking at in the trachea and then in the main bronchi. Then you have simple cuboidal epithelial in the respiratory bronchioles, and then finally simple squamous epithelial in the alveoli for maximum gas exchange. So the branches of the bronchial tree are just air passages, and so their job is just to transport the air, but the alveoli are where gas exchange occurs. And so we're going to put oxygen into the from the blood into the cells, and then the cells will release CO2 for the blood to the alveoli. And so here we see this is actually in the alveoli. So think about this. If this is air, you haven't passed a membrane yet. Okay? And so we're still external respiration. But it's here that oxygen leaves from this lumen of the alveola and goes into the blood. And CO2 is returned. So this is where blood's being picked up. Notice blood flow's moving this way. So this is the artery, or the arteriole, a small branch, right? So here we're bringing blood away from the heart. Now usually arteries aren't red. Usually veins are colored blue. But here your artery is blue. Why? Because it has low oxygen. So what happens is as it goes near this alveolus, it's picking up oxygen and it becomes oxygenated blood, and now it heads back to the heart in the pulmonary vein eventually. And so they color it red because it picked up oxygen here. That is one difference in the pulmonary circuit, right?